every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air on the 26th of January 1966 in Adelaide, South Australia, was thick with the promise of a long, lazy public holiday. It was Australia Day, a day of summer at its zenith, of searing sun and the scent of salt and hot bitumen. It was a time of almost preternatural innocence, a cultural moment suspended in amber, when the screen doors of suburban homes were left unlocked and children were simply expected to come home when the streetlights flickered on. The world, for most Australians, felt vast but safe, a sunburnt country of boundless optimism. In the seaside suburb of Somerton Park, at number 109 Harding Street, this feeling was no different. It was a simple brick veneer house, indistinguishable from thousands of others, home to Jim and Nancy Beaumont and their 3 children. There was 9-year-old Jane, the eldest, a responsible and sensible girl, already showing the first signs of the thoughtful adult she was destined to become. Then there was 7-year-old Arnna, the mischievous and spirited middle child, full of life and laughter. And finally, 4-year-old Grant, the baby of the family, adored by his sisters and doted upon by his parents. They were, by all accounts, a happy, ordinary family, their lives dictated by the gentle rhythms of school, work and weekends spent in the sprawling Australian sunshine. On this particular morning, the children were restless, eager to escape the climbing heat. They begged their mother Nancy to let them go to the nearby Glenelg beach, a popular spot just a few kilometers away. It was a trip they had made before, but never alone. Jane, however, was confident. She was 9, after all. She knew the way. The bus ride was short, just 5 minutes. She could look after Arnna and Grant. Reluctantly, Nancy agreed. It was a decision that would have been unremarkable at the time, a simple act of trust between a mother and her child, a rite of passage in a world that encouraged youthful independence. She gave Jane 8 shillings and 6pence for bus fare and a snack, a meat pie and a pasty perhaps, from the local bakery. She watched them walk down the street towards the bus stop, 3 small figures in their summer clothes, their towels slung over their shoulders, their futures stretching out before them like the endless blue of the ocean they were heading towards. She told them to be back on the 12 o'clock bus. But the 12 o'clock bus came and went, then the 2 o'clock bus. With each passing hour, the easy rhythm of that summer day began to fray. A quiet unease curdled into sickening dread. Jim Beaumont arrived home from his job as a taxi driver to find a frantic Nancy. By late afternoon, the Beaumont children were officially reported missing. They had walked into the shimmering heat haze of an Australian summer morning and had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. Their disappearance would ignite the largest police investigation in the nation's history, a search that would span decades and continents. It would give birth to dark theories, cruel hoaxes, and a gallery of chilling suspects. But more than that, it would become a cultural touchstone, a singular event that cleaved Australian history into a before and an after. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a national trauma. We will explore how the vanishing of 3 children from a sun-drenched beach on a summer's day eroded a nation's innocence, forever altering the relationship between parents, their children, and the world outside their front door. This is the story of a crime defined not by what was found, but by what was lost, and the profound, unending silence it left behind. To understand the depth of the wound inflicted by the Beaumont case, you must first understand the world from which they were taken. Adelaide in the 1960s was often called the City of Churches. It was a conservative, quiet capital, a place that prided itself on its civility and its perceived safety. It was the epitome of post-war Australian suburbia, a sprawling landscape of new brick homes, manicured lawns, and a burgeoning sense of middle-class prosperity. For families like the Beaumonts, life was simple and good. Jim Beaumont, a former soldier, worked long hours as a draper and later a taxi driver. Nancy was a homemaker, her life revolving around her husband and their 3 beautiful children. Their home on Harding Street was a modest one, but it was filled with the typical sounds and energy of a young family. Jane, born in 1956, was the little mother. She was mature for her age, a trait that gave Nancy the confidence to entrust her with her younger siblings. She was a good student at the local Paringa Park Primary School, a reliable child who understood rules and boundaries. Arnna, born in 1958, was her opposite in many ways. She was the firecracker, a whirlwind of energy who was known for her cheeky, sometimes defiant nature. She was thin and wiry, a tomboy who loved to play and explore. And then there was Grant, born in 1961. He was a typical 4-year-old boy, full of wonder and still firmly attached to his mother's side, though he adored following his older sisters on their adventures. The social fabric of the time was woven with a degree of freedom that is almost unimaginable today. Children were a common sight, playing unsupervised in streets, parks, and vacant lots. They would leave home in the morning and return at dusk, their parents trusting in the ambient safety of the community. It wasn't neglect, it was the norm. The concept of stranger danger, as we now know, it simply wasn't part of the public consciousness. The greatest fears for a child were accidents, a fall from a tree, a scrape on the pavement, perhaps getting hit by a car. The idea of a predator methodically targeting and abducting children in broad daylight from a crowded public place was the stuff of grim European fairy tales, not the reality of life in sunny Adelaide. Glenelg Beach was the city's playground. On a public holiday like Australia Day, it was a kaleidoscope of activity. Families packed the sand, children shrieked with delight in the shallows, and teenagers congregated near the pier and the amusement park. It was a place of communal joy, a setting that felt inherently safe due to the sheer number of people present. The bus route from Somerton Park to Glenelg was a straight shot, a simple journey down Jetty Road. For Jane, Arnna, and Grant, it was a familiar path, a gateway to a world of sun, sand, and fun. Nancy Beaumont's instructions were clear. They were to take the bus to the beach, play in the area near the Collie Reserve and the Patawalonga River mouth, a shallow, safe spot for young children, and return on the 12 o'clock bus. The entire trip was meant to last only a few hours, a small taste of independence before the family reunited for the rest of the holiday. Nancy had walked them to the bus stop on the corner of Harding Street and Diagonal Road at about 10 o'clock. It was the last time she would ever see them. Her final image was of her 3 children, laughing and excited, waving goodbye before clambering aboard the bus, their small forms framed for a moment in the window before the vehicle pulled away and merged with the morning traffic. It was a perfectly ordinary moment, one of thousands in a mother's life, yet it would be frozen in time, replayed in her mind for the next 50 years with an unbearable, agonizing weight. The morning of January 26th unfolded as planned, at least initially. The bus driver later confirmed that the 3 children had boarded his bus and disembarked at Glenelg around 10:15 a.m. They were seen by several people they knew, playing on the grass of Collie Reserve near the beach. They were seen turning on a sprinkler and splashing in the water. their laughter carrying on the warm air. These sightings were normal, happy, and entirely consistent with the children's plans. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. But then the narrative begins to shift. Something or someone enters the picture. A local postman, a man who knew the children well, saw them walking along Jetty Road, away from the beach, at approximately 11:15 a.m. They seemed happy and were holding hands. He noted that they were walking in the direction of their home. But it was far too early for them to have caught the 12 o'clock bus. They acknowledged him with a wave and a smile. Nothing seemed amiss. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Beaumont children by someone who personally knew them. Around the same time, a shopkeeper at Wenzel's Bakery on Jetty Road, a place the children loved, served a customer she later identified as Jane Beaumont. Jane purchased a meat pie and a pasty, not with the coins Nancy had given her, but with a £1 note. This detail was significant. Where did a 9-year-old girl get a £1 note? It was a substantial amount of money for a child in 1966. Nancy Beaumont was certain she had not given it to her. The implication was chilling. Someone else had. The most crucial sightings came from a handful of independent witnesses at the beach itself. They described seeing the 3 children playing with a man. He was tall, thin, with a suntanned complexion and fair to light brown hair. He was described as being in his mid-30s, with a lean, athletic build. One witness saw him playing with the children, helping young Grant, who had stumbled. He seemed friendly, avuncular. He helped them get dressed after they had been swimming. It all looked so normal. A father and uncle, a family friend perhaps, enjoying a day at the beach with the kids. No one saw any sign of distress. The children were laughing, seemingly at ease in his company. Another witness, a woman sitting on a bench, saw the man with the 3 children a little later. Arnna, in her typical playful fashion, apparently tapped the man with her towel, and he playfully chased her. It was the kind of innocent interaction that would normally go unnoticed. But in retrospect, every detail became freighted with menace. Who was this man? Why were the children so comfortable with him? Jane, the responsible one, was known to be shy around strangers. Yet she seemed to have accepted this man's presence completely. It suggested a level of familiarity, that he had somehow gained their trust with a practiced, predatory skill. The timeline becomes blurry after this. A woman who was on the 2 o'clock bus from Glenelg, the bus Nancy had desperately hoped her children would be on, later told police she thought she might have seen the children. She said 3 children matching their descriptions were on the bus, accompanied by the same tall, blonde man. They seemed happy, she recalled. Another report, even more disturbing, came from a car salesman who claimed to see a man and 3 children, a girl and a boy, he wasn't sure about the third, getting into a car near the Glenelg jetty. The time was uncertain. Like so many other leads, it was a fragment, a piece of a puzzle with no picture on the box. Back at 109 Harding Street, the afternoon sun beat down on the empty front yard. Nancy Beaumont's anxiety grew with each ticking minute. She called friends. She called the police. Jim rushed home. The initial response was measured. Children often lost track of time. They probably missed the bus and were walking home. But as dusk began to settle, tinting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the full weight of the situation descended upon the family and the local police force. This was not a simple case of tardiness. Something was terribly wrong. The search began that evening, a frantic, localized effort. Police and neighbors fanned out, their flashlights cutting cones of light through the suburban darkness, calling out the children's names. Jane, Arnna, Grant. The sounds echoed in the quiet streets unanswered, As the hours stretched into a new day, the scope of the operation exploded. What had started as a local police matter rapidly transformed into the largest search in South Australia's history. The beaches were scoured inch by painful inch. Police on horseback combed the nearby sand dunes. Boats crisscrossed the waters of St. Vincent Gulf, their crews scanning for any sign of a tragic accident. Drains, sheds, and abandoned buildings were meticulously searched. The public response was overwhelming. Hundreds of volunteers, ordinary citizens, shaken from their holiday stupor, joined the search, a civilian army driven by a collective sense of horror and civic duty. But they found nothing. Not a single item of clothing. Not a towel. Not a shoe. It was as if the 3 children, along with the tall blonde man, had simply been erased from the face of the earth. The lack of physical evidence was baffling and terrifying. A drowning would have likely left bodies washed ashore. An accident would have left traces. A kidnapping for ransom, the police initially suspected, would have been followed by a demand. But the phone at the Beaumont home remained silent, except for the incessant ringing of journalists and the hollow condolences of friends. The silence from the abductor was absolute. The investigation, led by Detective Superintendent Pat Hurley, was exhaustive. Police interviewed thousands of people. Every bus driver, every shopkeeper, every resident in the vicinity of Glenelg Beach was questioned. From the disparate witness accounts, they pieced together a composite sketch of the primary suspect. The image of the blonde man, tall, lean, tanned, handsome in a conventional way, was plastered on newspapers and television screens across the country. He became a national boogeyman, a faceless phantom who had walked among families on a crowded beach and stolen 3 children in plain sight. The police theory began to solidify. The perpetrator was not an opportunist. This was a planned abduction. He had likely watched the children, perhaps on previous visits to the beach. He had identified Jane as the key, the one whose trust he needed to gain. The £1 note suggested he had offered to buy them treats, a simple, effective lure, his ability to charm them, to make them feel safe enough to leave the beach with him, pointed to a chilling level of predatory sophistication. He had to be plausible, friendly, and utterly non-threatening. He had disarmed not only the children, but every adult who saw them together. He had hidden in plain sight his crime cloaked in the veneer of normalcy. The Beaumonts, meanwhile, were plunged into a living nightmare. Their home became the epicenter of a media storm. Reporters camped on their lawn. Their cameras and microphones a constant intrusive presence. Jim and Nancy were forced to perform their grief for a captivated nation, their faces etched with a pain that was both deeply personal and suddenly public property. They appeared on television, pleading for the safe return of their children, their voices trembling but their resolve firm. Jim spoke directly to the abductor, promising no retribution, only a desperate desire to have his family whole again. Nancy, a naturally private woman, was thrust into an unbearable spotlight, her every tear and tremor scrutinized by millions. Their private tragedy had become a national obsession. As days turned into weeks, the hope of finding the children alive began to fade, replaced by a grim determination to find out what had happened. The police were inundated with leads, thousands of them, from all over Australia and even overseas. Every report of a tall blonde man, every abandoned car, every strange disturbance was meticulously followed up. But each lead dissolved into a dead end. The investigation was a vast, sprawling effort that ultimately led nowhere. The case file grew thicker, filled with witness statements, theories, and false alarms. But the central pages remained terrifyingly blank. The what, where, and why of the children's fate were a complete mystery. The perfect crime, it seemed, had been committed, leaving behind only an unfillable void and a family and a nation suspended in a state of perpetual, agonizing uncertainty. In the vacuum of hard evidence, the Beaumont case became a breeding ground for speculation, bizarre theories, and cruel deception. For Jim and Nancy Beaumont, the torment of not knowing was compounded by a series of hoaxes that alternately raised and shattered their hopes. The most infamous of these began nearly 2 years after the children vanished. In November of 1968, the Beaumonts received 2 letters, one addressed to them and one addressed to the police. The letters were supposedly written by Jane, the eldest daughter. The first letter described a relatively pleasant life. Jane wrote that she was living with her siblings and the man who had taken them, whom she referred to as the man. She claimed they were being cared for and were happy. The letter was a strange mix of childish prose and adult phrasing, leading investigators to believe it was composed by an adult, attempting to mimic a child's writing style. A second letter followed, more detailed and specific. It suggested that the man was willing to return the children. It proposed a meeting point, a specific time and place. The police and the Beaumonts were caught in a terrible dilemma. Was this a genuine, albeit strange, communication from the kidnapper, or a sadistic prank? They had to treat it as real. The letter instructed Jim to go to a designated spot in the country, carrying a sum of money. A massive police operation was mounted, with officers hiding in the surrounding area, waiting to intercept the man and hopefully recover the children. Jim Beaumont, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope, went to the meeting place as instructed. He waited and waited, but no one came. It was a crushing blow. Some time later, a third letter arrived. This time, the writer acknowledged that they had seen the police presence and had been scared off. It claimed they were now the guardian of the children and would not be returning them. Forensic analysis of the letters eventually revealed they had been handled by a 41-year-old man who was a teenager at the time. He claimed he had written them as a joke. He was never charged, as the statute of limitations for such an offense had passed. The emotional devastation this joke inflicted upon the Beaumont family is immeasurable. It was an act of profound cruelty, a psychological torture visited upon a family already enduring the unimaginable. The case also attracted the attention of charlatans and self-proclaimed psychics, most notably the Dutch clairvoyant Gerard Croiset. In 1966, a group of wealthy Adelaide citizens, desperate for a breakthrough, funded a trip for Croiset to come to Australia to work on the case. Croiset was a minor celebrity in Europe, claiming to have helped police solve numerous crimes with his psychic abilities. His arrival created a media frenzy. He was hailed by some as the last best hope for finding the children. Croiset made a series of pronouncements. He claimed the children were buried, not far from their home. He led police to a newly constructed warehouse in the suburb of North Plympton, not far from the Beaumont residence. He was adamant that their bodies would be found there, buried beneath a concrete floor. He said he had a vision of them being interred there, their remains encased in the building's foundation. The public was captivated. For a few frantic days, it seemed a resolution was at hand. The owners of the warehouse, swept up in the media storm and public pressure, reluctantly agreed to allow an excavation. In front of television cameras and a crowd of onlookers, workers brought in jackhammers and began to tear up the concrete floor. The nation held its breath, but as they dug deeper and deeper into the earth, they found nothing but soil and rock. There were no bodies. There was no evidence of any disturbance. Croiset's vision was a complete and utter fabrication. He quietly left the country, his reputation in tatters, leaving behind nothing but a broken concrete floor and the Beaumonts' renewed despair. The entire episode was a circus, a painful and public diversion that ultimately served only to deepen the mystery and exploit the family's grief for public spectacle. It was a stark lesson in the dangers of desperation, and how, in the absence of facts, people will cling to even the most outlandish of hopes. Over the long decades that followed, the Beaumont case never truly went cold. It festered in the public consciousness, a persistent, unanswered question. For law enforcement, it became a generational obsession, with new detectives inheriting the voluminous files and re-examining the scant evidence with fresh eyes. This persistence led them to a series of compelling, yet ultimately unprovable, suspects. Each one seemed to fit the profile in some way, a chilling echo of the blonde man from the beach. But each investigation ultimately hit a wall of insufficient evidence. One of the most significant persons of interest was Arthur Stanley Brown. Brown was a career criminal and a convicted pedophile who bore a striking resemblance to the 1966 composite sketch of the suspect. He was tall, thin, and fair-haired. At the time of the disappearance, he was living in Adelaide and working for a government agency that required him to travel extensively around the area, including Glenelg. Brown was a meticulous man, obsessed with clocks and records, yet his movements on Australia Day 1966 were unaccounted for. He was a known predator with a history of attacking children. Years later, in the 1990s, police were investigating Brown for the 1970 abduction and murder of two sisters, Judith and Susan McKay, in Townsville, Queensland. The parallels to the Beaumont case were unnerving. As investigators dug into Brown's past, they discovered his presence in Adelaide in 1966. He became a prime suspect. Detectives interviewed him when he was an old man, suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He denied any involvement, his memory too fragmented to provide a coherent alibi or confession, though the circumstantial evidence was strong. The resemblance, the proximity, the predatory history, there was no direct physical evidence to link him to the Beaumonts. Brown died in 2002, taking any secrets he might have had to his grave. For many investigators, he remains the most likely perpetrator, a ghost who almost perfectly matched the phantom from the beach. Another dark thread of inquiry led investigators to Bevan Spencer von Einem, one of Australia's most notorious convicted murderers. Von Einem was a central figure in the so-called family murders, a series of horrific killings of young men that terrorized Adelaide in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was convicted in 1984 for the brutal murder of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin. While in prison, a witness, a man identified only as Mr. B, came forward with a shocking claim. He told police that he had overheard von Einem boasting about killing the Beaumont children. According to this witness, von Einem described how he had taken the children from Glenelg to his home, where he performed experiments on them. He allegedly said that he had killed one of the children, and then had to kill the other two to silence them. He claimed to have disposed of their bodies near a drainpipe in the Adelaide Hills. The testimony was horrifying and detailed. It provided a potential explanation for what happened after the children left the beach. However, the witness's credibility was questioned, and his account could not be independently corroborated. Despite extensive searches in the area von Einem allegedly indicated, no remains were ever found. Von Einem himself has always denied any involvement. The connection remains a tantalizing but unproven theory, a glimpse into the city's dark underbelly that may or may not intersect with the fate of Jane, Arnna, and Grant. The case of the Beaumont children is also inextricably linked in the public mind to another tragic Adelaide abduction. In August 1973, 7 years after the Beaumonts vanished, 2 young girls, 11-year-old Kirst Gordon and 4-year-old Joanne Ratcliffe, disappeared from the Adelaide Oval during a football match. The parallels were haunting. 2 children, abducted in broad daylight from a crowded public place. The prime suspect in that case was also described as a tall, thin man. The disappearances of Gordon and Ratcliffe, which also remain unsolved, seem to suggest a pattern, that a serial child predator was operating in Adelaide over a period of many years. Was it the same man? Was it Arthur Stanley Brown, who was still living in the area at the time, or was it someone else entirely, part of a sinister network that operated in the shadows of the city of churches? The questions multiplied, weaving the fates of these lost children into a larger, more terrifying tapestry of unsolved crime. Decades passed. New leads emerged, only to fade away. Then, in 2013, the case took another dramatic turn with the emergence of a new suspect, Harry Phipps. Phipps was a wealthy Adelaide businessman and factory owner who had died in 2004. The allegations against him came from his own son, Hayden Phipps, and another man who had worked for Phipps as a teenager. These 2 men came forward with stories they had suppressed for nearly 50 years. They claimed that Harry Phipps was a pedophile who had abused them both. They also recalled seeing the 3 Beaumont children at Phipps's house in Glenelg on the day they disappeared. Their account was detailed and compelling. They claimed Phipps, who bore a strong resemblance to the police sketch, had brought the children to his home. Later, they alleged, Phipps enlisted them to help dig a large hole at his factory property in the suburb of North Plympton. Coincidentally, the same area where the psychic Gerard Croiset had directed police decades earlier. They believed Phipps had buried the children's bodies there. The claims were so credible that in 2018, police launched a major excavation at the site of the old Phipps factory. Once again, the nation watched, hoping that after more than 50 years there might finally be an answer. The excavation was a painstaking, scientific process. Ground-penetrating radar identified anomalies in the soil. Heavy machinery was brought in to carefully remove layers of earth. For 2 days, forensic investigators sifted through the dirt, searching for any human remains or fragments of evidence. But just like the dig, prompted by the psychic in 1966, the search yielded nothing. Animal bones were found along with general waste from the factory's operation, but there was no sign of the Beaumont children. It was another dead end, another painful anticlimax in a case defined by them. Harry Phipps remains a significant person of interest, another plausible suspect against whom there is no definitive proof. And so the list of suspects remains a gallery of maybes, a collection of men who fit the profile, who were in the right place at the right time, and who had the capacity for great evil. But a compelling profile is not proof. A resemblance is not evidence, and a third-hand confession is not a conviction. The case file on the Beaumont children is a monument to circumstantial evidence, a sprawling collection of puzzle pieces that refuse to fit together into a coherent picture. The blonde man from the beach remains a phantom, his identity as elusive today as it was in 1966. The disappearance of the Beaumont children was more than just a crime. It was a cultural flashpoint. It marked the definitive end of an era of perceived innocence in Australia. The idea that a predator could so brazenly pluck 3 children from a bustling public space sent a shockwave through the national psyche. The story dominated headlines for months, then years. It was a constant topic of conversation around dinner tables and in schoolyards. The faces of Jane, Arnna, and Grant, reproduced in grainy black and white, became iconic symbols of lost innocence. Their names became a cautionary tale, a shorthand for the unthinkable. Before 1966, the Australian way of life for children was one of remarkable freedom. It was a world of unlocked doors, of roaming neighborhoods, of an unspoken trust in the safety of the community. After the Beaumonts, that world began to vanish. A new era of anxiety dawned. Parents who had once let their children play freely now watched them with a hawk's eye. The walk to school, once a solo adventure, became a supervised journey. Parks that were once children's territory became places of potential danger. The phrase stranger danger entered the Australian lexicon, taught with a new and terrifying urgency. The media played a significant role in this societal shift. The Beaumont case was one of the first major Australian crimes to be extensively covered by television, bringing the story into living rooms with an unprecedented immediacy. The constant updates, the police sketches, the heart-wrenching interviews with Jim and Nancy Beaumont, it all contributed to a heightened sense of public fear. The case created a moral panic, a pervasive sense that the world was a much more dangerous place than anyone had previously believed. This single event is often credited by sociologists and historians with fundamentally altering Australian parenting styles, ushering in the age of the helicopter parent, and curtailing the freedoms that previous generations had taken for granted. For Jim and Nancy Beaumont, the rest of their lives were defined by that one summer day. They never gave up hope, at least not publicly. They remained in the same house on Harding Street for decades, a self-imposed sentence of waiting. They never changed the locks, never altered the children's bedrooms, clinging to the sliver of a chance that their children might one day walk back through the front door. They were gracious in the face of endless media intrusion and public speculation, but their grief was a palpable, living thing. They eventually divorced, the immense strain of their shared tragedy having fractured their bond. Nancy passed away in 2019, at the age of 92. Jim Beaumont is now in his late 90s. They live their entire adult lives in the shadow of their children's absence, a state of suspended animation, unable to mourn, unable to move on. Their quiet dignity in the face of such unimaginable, unending pain is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire story. The case remains open. Every few years, a new lead or a new theory surfaces, briefly reigniting public interest before flickering out. Modern forensic science, such as DNA analysis, has been of little use in a case with no bodies and no physical evidence from the crime scene. The mystery endures, not as a whodunit, but as a what happened. The crime committed on that Australia Day was so complete, so absolute in its execution, that it left behind no clues, only questions. What was the ultimate fate of the children? Were they murdered that same day? Were they held captive? The possibilities are all horrific, and the lack of a definitive answer allows the darkest imaginings to flourish. Ultimately, the anatomy of this case is the anatomy of a void. It is a story built around an absence. There is no crime scene, only the place where the children were last seen. There are no bodies, only the memory of 3 vibrant lives. There is no confession, only the echo of witness accounts and the whispers of prison informants. There is no justice for the Beaumont family, only the cold comfort of knowing they have never been forgotten. The power of the story lies in its incompleteness. It is a wound on the Australian consciousness that has never fully healed, because a wound cannot heal when the source of the injury is still unknown. The legacy of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont is a profound and somber one. It is a legacy of changed laws, of heightened awareness, and of a generation of children raised with a fear their parents never knew. The sun still shines on Glenelg Beach. Children still laugh and play in the shallows. But something is different. There is a caution in the air now, an invisible tether that connects children to their parents. The naive trust of 1966 is gone, washed away like footprints in the sand. The empty space left by the Beaumont children was filled with a national fear, and that fear has cast a long shadow, one that stretches from a summer beach half a century ago all the way to the present day. What makes this case so haunting is not the complexity of the evidence, but the utter lack of it. A crime that was so perfect it left behind nothing but an ache of permanent loss. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.